This video was brought to you by our brand new channel, TLDR Business. Subscribe by clicking the link in the description. While it hasn't been in the news all that much recently, over the last few months, China's property crisis has continued to get worse. Home sales have continued to decline, consumer confidence has collapsed, and it looks like there's a battle brewing between Beijing and the regional authorities, who rely on land sales to fund their budgets. So in this video, we're going to be taking another look at China's ongoing property crisis and what the CCP might do next to prevent contagion into other sectors of the economy. So before we get into the most recent developments, a bit of context. Way back in the 80s, China began a rapid and massive urbanization, and the scale of this process is quite something. In the space of about 40 years, the percentage of Chinese people living in cities has gone from about 20% in 1980 to nearly 70% today. This rapid urbanization and the huge demand for housing that came with it created a huge boom for property developers. And as you'd expect, house prices rose rapidly, with the median Chinese house quintupling in price by 2005. This rise in price was even steeper in urban areas though, with the largest cities generally seeing at least twice the rate of increase when compared to other areas. In a race to outbuild other developers and in anticipation of further demand, Chinese real estate developers began borrowing increasingly large amounts of money. On the demand side, Chinese buyers basically poured all of their money into housing, in large part because it looked like a good investment. House prices had risen steadily for the last 40 years or so, and buyers assumed that they would continue to do so indefinitely. However, this, in combination with over-leveraged developers and endless speculative investment in housing, eventually created a massive property bubble. That left property prices in large Chinese cities 40 times the median salary, making them by far and away the most expensive anywhere around the world. In fact, property now accounts for an estimated 75% of all Chinese household wealth and 20 to 30% of all economic activity. For context, in the UK, which is also suffering through some sort of housing crisis at the moment, sees property accounting for about 36% of all household wealth, about half as much as China. Anyway, the CCP realised that this bubble was both dangerously large and limiting Chinese households' disposable income, which is why they introduced the 3 red lines in August of 2020, limiting the amount of money that Chinese developers could borrow. Now, this was a bit of a problem for those developers who relied on debt for their funding, most notably Evergrande, and as such, a wave of defaults soon followed. Worryingly for the CCP though, over the last few months things have only gotten worse, with new house prices seeing their 10th consecutive monthly decline, and analysis by Citigroup estimating that the non-performing loan ratio for China's property sector, i.e. the percentage of loans that are either late or at risk of default, has climbed to an all-time high of 29%. For context, the ratio of non-performing loans in Spain at the peak of the Spanish housing crisis was only a bit higher than this, at about 35%. Using this example, things get worrying for the CCP, because Spain went on to see a 30% drop in median house prices after the bubble burst, in a contraction that lasted for the best part of a decade. Now, looking at China specifically, things have been made worse by the CCP's stubborn zero-COVID policy, which has completely spooked markets. Shanghai's last lockdown, for example, caused a 14% drop in regional GDP, and consumer confidence across the country more generally is now down to an all-time low. You get the idea then. China's property market is continuing to slump. However, in the last week or so, another dimension to this crisis has emerged: a policy disagreement between the national government in Beijing and regional authorities. To understand this issue, you need to know that local governments rely on land sales for most of their spending. Essentially, since 1994, local and provincial governments have been responsible for paying for their own social services and meeting growth targets set by Beijing. Unfortunately for them, though, most taxes go straight to Beijing, meaning that the regions are underfunded, and they're not even technically allowed to borrow money to make up this gap. To get around this issue and make sure that they meet their growth targets, local governments set up local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs, which were basically just shadow companies. Local governments would give these LGFVs land for free, and then the LGFVs could sell that land to developers or use it as collateral to borrow money. Now, no one knows precisely how much money local governments have been implicitly borrowing via these financing vehicles, but whatever the exact figure, it's probably too much. Upper-end estimates put the figure at about 30% of local government revenue, or nearly 40% of GDP. However, with house prices falling, land prices have been dragged down with them, and as such, local governments have struggled to find new methods of funding. Land sales have now fallen by 72% in the last year, depriving local governments of about 20% of their funding. Worried about missing their growth targets, certain local governments have tried to revive their stumbling real estate sectors, essentially reversing the 3 red lines policy set by Beijing. However, over the last week or so, Beijing has cracked down, forcing the local governments to backtrack. For example, on Thursday, local authorities in Qingdao and Suzhou removed all restrictions on home purchases, only to U-turn just 24 hours later after strict directions from Beijing. It seems then that China's housing crisis, which began as an exclusively economic problem, has morphed into a political problem as well, pitting local authorities against Beijing. And this is difficult because national authorities don't think that China can afford higher house prices, while local governments can't afford lower ones. So what can happen from here? Well, the CCP are unlikely to tolerate a 30% drop in prices akin to what happened in Spain, which means they'll probably have to bail out struggling developers by somehow incorporating them into state-owned enterprises. With regards to the tension between local authorities and Beijing, the CCP only really have 2 options. They can either relax their own growth targets for local authorities and accept a lower annual GDP, or they can give local governments more control over their own tax revenues, but this would require significant cuts to national services. Either way, it doesn't look good, as the local government, national government, and business sector all collide in China. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, the intersection of business and politics, we cover exactly that on the TLDR Business channel. It might be a brand new channel, but we've already got videos over there on things like why Apple has more money than it wants, as well as a video on the ideology of Elon Musk and the secret economics of porn, where we find out the 2 household names who control the whole industry. You can subscribe to the channel and check out those videos by clicking the link in the description. We really appreciate your support.